It's Tuesday, June 1st, and today I posted an invitation or a recommendation for Academy students to start blogs. And I've talked about this in the past, I've written about this in the past, and I really can't emphasize enough the importance of blogging for students. And there are a number of misconceptions about blogging because of examples of what people have done with blogs, which are bad examples and therefore discourage other people from blogging and make the word blog to be sort of a bad word. But I'd like to talk at a little more length as I walk here today to get into the reason why I encourage students to blog, to create blogs, to write and post on blogs, and so on. One of the characteristic faults of Christian people is that they live with a nostalgic view of the past, studying the lives of saints, reading the history of the church, and they look back with a rosy-colored view of what life was like in the past, the sort of glory days myth, the good old days fantasy of being a Christian in the past and how good it was, and how much more difficult it is to be a Christian today. They look back at the past and they fantasize and imagine a world where mothers wore beautiful dresses, stayed at home and took care of children, living on farms where they had fresh milk and herbs and flowers from the gardens, and the children played with lambs out in the field. And there's all these sort of nostalgic fantasies about Christian life a long, long time ago. And while Christians are doing that, the work of their generation is left undone. The work of their own generation is neglected while they collect old books and read old stories and try to imitate old saints, many of whom were nothing like they imagined when they actually lived. They spend their time reminiscing or imagining or inventing a Christian past rather than serving the Christian present. And the work of the Christian community, especially the Christian laity, goes undone generation after generation while the Christians fantasize about the past and make excuses for the present and neglect the future. This can be seen nowhere more clearly than in education, and especially in Christian homeschooling, where this fault is amplified by 100. If we look at the current state of education in schools, if we look at the public schools, we'll see schools trying to make efficient use of technology like wireless internet technology, when the wireless technology actually is a sign that the age of schools is over, and that the schools and the teachers employed by the schools are no longer needed by students. The whole idea of the school with students working on wireless laptops is a contradiction. It's a ridiculous image. Children leaving their homes, getting on buses, being transported to a building in a central location, having all the children gathered together from all over the town or city or county, sitting in desks, and then opening up their laptops to access resources that they had the same access to at home. The whole idea of the wireless campus or the wireless school is an oxymoron. We need to understand that the future of education is homeschooling. Except it's not going to have this clumsy, weird connotation that it has had for the past 20 years, when homeschooling actually wasn't necessarily in the best interest of students. The whole pandemic crisis made this even clearer when we saw that it was safer and better for children to stay home than to go to school because of health concerns. Well, that's not true only when there's a pandemic. That's true every day. Every day. It's less healthy for large numbers of children to be gathered into single buildings in close community than it is for them to stay home. The pandemic revealed the health concerns of bringing large numbers of people together. The technology reveals the obsolete nature of schooling in general. And Christians have an opportunity to seize the moment, as it were, and homeschooling families most of all have the opportunity to take the lead in seizing this moment. And yet, when we look at the homeschooling families, we often find them going backwards in the opposite direction. We find them taking the kids out of school, out of the modern schools, which is great and opens up a million opportunities, and then we see them throwing all of those opportunities away by this Christian fault of living in the past. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we have this paradox every day where we, teaching classical Catholic studies, are seen as going back in time. But that's really a misconception, because the philosophy and theology and the classical liberal arts are not historic studies. They're timeless studies. They're as relevant today as they were in the Roman Empire. And they're as relevant today as they will be, if God wills, and human life goes on for another 2,000 years. They're timeless human studies. That's why they're called the humanities. They're human studies. As long as human beings exist, classical Catholic education will be the only true education. It will never change. We're not going back to something old. We're simply committing ourselves to something that's timeless and necessary, and not allowing ourselves to get caught up in fads, political fads, educational fads, cultural fads. We're moving past that and staying focused on true education. That's why we study the classical liberal arts. That's why we study the Summa Theologica and the sacred scriptures and the writings of the ancient philosophers, because these are studies for human beings for all time. And we have this paradox because while we are seen by most as being a program that's returning to the past, we're actually recommending the diligent use of modern communications technology. And this leaves many parents confused because they would love to come to the CLAA and find sort of a little Amish community of girls in bonnets and boys in overalls studying reading, writing, and arithmetic out of their little McGuffey's books. And what they find is recommendations for something much different than that. And many families will actually choose not to study the classical liberal arts because they would actually prefer an inferior modern K-12 curriculum that was never studied by any saints or wise men because it serves this fault of nostalgic Christian living. Because the parents want their children to use the same cursive writing books that they used when they were in second grade in 1985. Or they'd like their children to use an abacus like the ancient Roman children used. Or they would like their children to study the lessons the way children studied them in the 1600s, or in colonial America, or in medieval Europe, rather than make use of the tools and resources available to us in our own generation. And so they will choose an inferior, even false, curriculum because it uses a certain kind of book, or has colored pictures, or emphasizes cursive handwriting, and so on. Now, there's nothing we can do to help parents like that. But they've got education and the purpose of education all upside down. The purpose of education is to learn from the past to impact the present. The mission of the laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. And temporal affairs in our generation are not the same temporal affairs that existed in another generation. Most of the Catholics I know are experts in refuting the religious teachings of men who lived 500 years ago. They're experts in refuting Protestant ideas. They're experts at refuting the ideas of John Calvin and Martin Luther. They study all the arguments and learn how to refute Protestant ideas, and yet they have no knowledge of or answers for present ideas. Because even if we were to go among the Protestants in our society, they're not Lutherans and Calvinists. They're modern evangelicals who have a completely different set of beliefs and practices than the original 16th century reformers had, and yet most Catholics who talk about Protestants are talking about people who don't exist today. And all of their arguments and studies will only apply to you if you actually share all of the opinions of Martin Luther himself, which almost no one does. And this is the effect of this living in the past that's common among Christians. The greatest benefit of the classical liberal arts and ancient philosophy is that it helps us to understand what's going on right now, today. When a new idea comes out, ancient philosophy and scholastic theology, knowledge of the sacred scriptures, helps us to immediately understand what the real essential teaching is, or the essential principles that are at the root of a modern idea. And it allows us to diagnose the error and fix the error today in our generation with new arguments, new ideas, solving new problems with new solutions. But those solutions are at the same time ancient Because they're based on timeless principles of philosophy and theology. They're ancient and yet modern. And this is true wisdom. This is true education. Education that is not ancient because it's historic, but because it's timeless. It was true 500 years ago, and it will be true 500 years from now. And we're able to learn this timeless, principled wisdom, face new challenges, and solve them from these principles. Not invent straw men or speak to people who don't exist today and pretend that we're solving problems that aren't even present in our society. They're not the problems that are actually hurting people today. They're just idle historical controversies that have already been dealt with. And it creates this sort of fake Catholic apologist who walks around pretending he's got refutations for everything, but his refutations are for men who don't live anymore, who have already been refuted, like a man who goes into battle to fight all the dead enemies lying on the battlefield. The real soldiers are those who fight the living enemies, who actually pose a threat and can do harm. And it's that kind of a Christian mind that needs to be formed, and it's formed by timeless wisdom and principles that can be applied to new individual cases of false teaching, false ideas, false practices, and so on. Now, in our generation, we're studying the classical Catholic curriculum to learn these principles. We're studying sacred scripture. We're studying the Summa Theologica. We're studying the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so that we can know the content of divine revelation that can enlighten our path, as the Psalms tell us. We're studying ancient philosophy because all of the ideas that attract men, all of the lies and fallacies that the devil uses to deceive men and lead men into error were present in the ancient world, and those same fallacies are present today. But they have different forms. They're dressed different. They're worded different. They use a different vocabulary. And we have to be able to distinguish, to discern, I should say. We have to be able to discern the true nature of things that appear. And we can often realize that this is an old trick being presented in a new form. And that's why we study the ancient philosophy and medieval scholastic theology. But when we consider our generation, we're not carving the Ten Commandments on tablets of stone like Moses. We're not writing on parchments and scrolls like the ancient prophets and apostles. We're not debating with philosophers in the Athenian marketplace. The warfare that we have to fight as Christians is very different than it was in other generations. The warfare that we have to fight takes place largely in a digital environment. And many will scoff at this idea, but what they say with their mouth is denied by their actual actions and behavior. One of the most influential digital marketers working today, a man who I have probably referred to before, is Gary Vaynerchuk. He's an expert on the use of social media in marketing and communication. And in one of his conference talks, he stands on the stage in front of a crowd of 800 or 900 people who have gathered, and he tells them this, pointing to the stage and to the auditorium that they're in. He says, this is fake. And what's online is real. This is fake. And what's online is real. And what he means by that is people are making decisions based on what's online. People are making choices based on what's online. People are not running their lives based on what their neighbors are doing outside across the street. They're not purchasing things based on what is available for sale in the local mall. They're not driving a car that they learned about by visiting all of the different dealerships. They're not studying from books or listening to present teachers standing in front of them at a podium. They're not learning the faith from sitting in pews in a church. They're learning and thinking and deciding and choosing based on what they're learning online, whether it's on YouTube, on a website, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok. When it comes down to spending money, making decisions, choosing to believe something, those decisions are being made under the influence of the digital media. That's where the battle is in our generation. That's the battlefield. Now, it's not through idle discussions on Facebook groups or forums. It's bigger than that and more complex than that. And I'm not going to get into all of these issues because it's a very complex study that takes time. But what I am concerned with as a teacher and as a father is that Christian children are not being introduced to this reality. And they're actually entering into this digital world, looking at it as consumers and spectators rather than as influencers. And what we need to do is raise children who see the internet and digital media not as a source of entertainment or consumption, but who see it as a platform for them to influence others. Who controls the digital media is open. That's the battle. Who controls what people are watching on YouTube or reading on Facebook or seeing on Instagram is in the power of those who are publishing content. You can hear people with conspiracy theories about how the social media giants and the search engines are controlling and censoring information, but I can demonstrate you the falsehood of those conspiracy theories in 5 minutes. And I've done that multiple times just to show how stupid this talk is, which is used by people as an excuse to abandon the battlefield, as it were, claiming that it's not a fair fight, there's no chance, we can't win, let's go do something else. And what they do is they leave the actual influential digital platforms and they go and start their own, stupidly undermining the whole point of that platform. And what they ignore is that while they may run away from the battle, their children will not follow them onto their little private platform, but their children will go to the large public platforms because they're going to have to. Because that's where business, education, marketing, religion, entertainment. That's where all of the major industries work today. That's why Gary Vaynerchuk has an advertising agency worth hundreds of millions of dollars with clients like Pepsi and Verizon and all the biggest corporations, and all he does is social media and digital marketing. So this brings us back to the topic. The point at which all of this work begins, where children can learn to think of themselves as influencers rather than fans or subscribers or spectators. Where this begins is the simple action of posting your content to the internet. Seeing the internet as a place where you, the Christian, post your content for other people to read and watch and listen to. Not a place where you go to read and watch and listen to other people's content. When Jesus sent his disciples into the world, he said, "Go into the world and make disciples." That's how you and every child should approach the internet. When they log in to their Google account or Facebook account or blog account, they should say, "I am going into the world to make disciples." And they need to learn to do that. They need to practice that from their youth. The internet is a place where you share your ideas, not where you go and surf the web and watch the videos made by the world and by the influencers who are sharing their ideas. The place where this work begins is in blogging. And this is why I strongly encourage parents to help their children get started in blogging. If you want to play Amish and live like a Mennonite, there's nothing that I can say. But remember, the Amish inherit farms. The Amish have careers prepared for them. The Amish have whole communities where they can choose to remain and live happily ever after, marrying other Amish children and living happily ever after in their Amish communities. When modern people imitate that kind of exclusivity, what they neglect is the fact that your children don't inherit what the Amish children inherit. The reason why they can preserve a historic culture in the Amish community is because the Amish are extremely industrious and wealthy. If you choose to stay in the Amish community, you don't ever have to leave. There's work for you for the rest of your life. When Christians choose to do these things, when they choose to raise their children with a focus on some kind of historical culture, they leave those children dependent on the world for employment, and yet trained and prepared for a world that doesn't actually exist. That's why it's not innocent and cute to play this Amish culture game in Christian community. To have a suburban family that barely has room in the house for the kids to live as it is, to raise children who are going to have to leave that house and go make a life on their own, and yet are being educated and trained to work in an agricultural society that they have no access to. That's not responsible parenting. That's just a short-sighted and selfish retreat from the actual work of parenting and education. I live on a farm. I don't have enough land or a big enough house to allow my 10 children to stay here for the rest of their life. They have to go out and make a way for themselves. I teach classical liberal arts. There's barely enough money for me to provide for my own needs. and for the costs of doing the work. I can't employ my children. They have to go and establish lives and occupations of their own. And when I educate them, I can't educate them to be little William Michaels, because their life is not going to be like mine. I had to scrap and fight and scrape as a 20 and 30-year-old to establish a family, to establish my own income and occupation. My children have to fight that same fight. And when I educate my children, I can't educate them to live like Damia and me live. I have to educate them so that they have a good opportunity to go into the world and make a responsible, honest living in the world. If they choose to pursue a Christian life with their own independent adult activities, that's between them and God. I can teach them the faith. I can teach them timeless wisdom and principles of life, but I cannot control the practical details of their life, because they're going to have to go and earn a living for themselves, just like I did, and it's going to look very different, and they're going to be doing it in a society that's very different from the society that I had to do it in. This is the real challenge and work of parenting, and it's why parents have to focus on the timeless principles and cannot try to control the specifics or the culture. They have to focus on the principles, because the children are going to have to apply those principles to their own unique sets of specifics in their own life and occupation. What I recommend is that they start blogging when they're young and learn to see the internet as a place to share their ideas, to promote their own interests, to promote their own causes, to learn how marketing works, to learn how advertising works, to learn how the internet works, to learn how search engines work, to learn how social media works, to learn how to find an audience, to access an audience, to communicate with an audience, to network with other like-minded people who share similar interests or who complement their knowledge and skills with different knowledge and skills. That work begins with blogging. It's free to create a blog. Students can create as many blogs as they like. They can create a blog for every different thing that they're interested in. What I recommend, though, first, is that they create a blog for their studies, as a sort of journal of their studies. I give students permission to use any content on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website free. Hundreds of lessons, articles, the entire library that's available on the Academy website. Students may use the content freely on their student blogs. I just ask that they link to it and make sure that they cite the source, because they have to learn about plagiarism, which can get them into a lot of trouble down the road. But all the content of the CLAA website is free for them to use however they please. They can write daily journals about what they're studying, write comments, share things that they write, share their assignments, share work that they do. I strongly recommend that they start blogging. The first blog they can start is a student blog where they simply journal their studies in the academy. Now, one of the benefits for a student blog is that when it comes time to apply to college, we all know about the college essay. Well, the college essay was needed in the 1990s because it gave the schools, the admission board, a way to get to know something about the students' thoughts and communication skills. And so, in order to get a better idea of the student's personality and ideas, college would ask the student to write an essay. And the essay usually addressed some general question about life and purpose, studies and plans, and so on. And the child would write this essay and include it with his application materials and send it in. In 2021, if children are writing college essays, they're just missing the point. Students today can have their own YouTube channels, their own blogs and websites. A student can have 100,000 followers on a social media channel and can say to the college they're applying to, hey, you want proof of my intellectual curiosity? You want proof of my entrepreneurial spirit? You want proof that I'm active, that I'm social? Check out my YouTube channel. Check out my blog. Here, check out my social media accounts. This is real evidence of active study, communication, leadership, and so on in our generation. College is not going to be impressed by a college essay typed on paper, spaced with 1.5 line height lines with 12 point times. No one cares about that stuff in 2021. There are kids on the internet with hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers, posting pictures of their baseball games, of their ballet recital, of their piano performance, posting their artwork, posting their stories and poems they write, receiving criticism and feedback from people all over the world. It's just not how modern communication works. It's not impressive for a kid to say, oh, here, I typed an essay. See how intellectually active and curious I am? Look, I typed up this essay. This is 2021. It's a digital media age. And children are going to have to learn to communicate and use digital media for any profession that they go into. Any profession. You can go on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and you'll find all of the religious orders are there. The Pope is there. Everyone is online. Even the religious communities, the bishops, the priests. There's no virtue in scoffing at the platforms on which all of human society communicates in the 21st century, and then talk about rhetoric, the art of communication, composition, when if you're off these platforms, you're not communicating. You're failing the art of communication. You're not a public speaker if you write a speech that sits in a folder on your desk. That's not public speaking. That's just a journal. That's a diary. If you want to be a public speaker, flip the camera on your phone and speak to the whole world on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. Publish a blog post that can be found by a search on Google and be read by people all over the world. This is how communication works today. As I said at the beginning of this talk, the modern school is obsolete. The modern school is obsolete. To go to school and write an essay to hand to a teacher or to read to your classmates so that you can get some peer feedback, when the entire human population is accessible from your desk in your living room, just makes no sense. If you want peer review, you can post an article on the Medium. You can post an article on a blog. You can make a video and post the video on YouTube and share it on all social media channels. We have to learn to embrace the reality of digital communication, or Christians are going to run the risk of being effectively erased from human communication, because, as I said before, what's happening online today is what's real. It's where the influence is found that's shaping the political actions in our society, the laws, the institutions, the churches, the schools, the universities. The influencers are not at the homeschool conference. They're not pictured on the back of a paperback book. The influencers are not in the pulpits of our churches. The influencers are on the internet. You can deny that and scoff at it, but you're going to learn it the hard way eventually. This technology that we see emerging over the past 20 years is here to stay. It's not going away. And you, as an adult, may be able to get through this life and reach your retirement age and live happily after and boast that you never had to learn it or use it. But your children can't do so. Your children need to learn, as part of their education, how to communicate and study using modern digital media. I'm happy to help them learn all phases of this work because I engage in it all day, every day. It's essential to the existence of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And if you look around, you'll see that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is working to restore classical Catholic education, and it wouldn't even be possible without the help of digital media. And all of the works that are going to follow, the work that I'm doing in the next generation, are going to be worked through this digital media, which is constantly changing. Students have to learn to use it, get involved in it, and then they're going to have to continue to pay attention to developments and changes and keep up with it, because at any time, an entire body of people can be eliminated from public discussion by a simple change in digital media. And we can't play with these things or ignore them. Or we're basically going to allow the world to take over every stage and microphone and spitefully have the Christian message silenced and erased by our negligence. We're told to go into the world and make disciples. That's what we need to teach our children. Not exactly how they're going to do that in their own life, but the fact that that's what we need to do. The channels and the media for doing this are different in 2021 than they were in 1200. They're even different than they were in 2010. Children have to learn to use these things actively rather than passively. They have to learn to become influencers on these media and not spectators and fans. That's what I'm concerned about. You can do whatever you want with their studies offline, but eventually they're going to learn and make decisions based on what they see in the digital environment. I'm hoping that we can teach our children to engage with it shrewdly and innocently and obediently, and that we don't ignore it and leave them vulnerable to be overwhelmed by it because they haven't had the chance to learn to use it and handle it responsibly through their education. I hope that's helpful. I trust that you can tell by tone of my voice how concerned I am about this and how much I dread the effects of the fault of Christian nostalgia is for these kids being homeschooled. We have the opportunity through homeschooling to make an incredible impact on society. Schools are obsolete. What goes on online is influencing every major decision in every industry at every level of society. Homeschool students have the opportunity to take leadership as these changes continue to develop at a crucial time in modern history. And we as parents have to help them understand how to do that rather than spike them and surrender the field to our opponents. God bless your studies.